Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the North Carolina Electronic Conference. Day 1 was certainly full of tremendous information and input from our panelists, and want to thank those that presented, the moderators, and all the people that joined us on day 1. And we're going to start day 2 with an incredibly interesting session. There's nothing more important in our process now than the notarization process, and whether it be a remote online notary or an in-person notarization or a RIN or several types. We've seen a fast evolution in what this notarization process looks like, again, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. And so there have been lots of activities on that particular product and the advancement of it. And so we have a terrific panel today led by Ozzie Stallworth, who is our esteemed chairman of the North Carolina E-Advisory Committee, as well as the Director of Notarization for the Secretary of State's Office in North Carolina, Jeremy Grant, who is the Managing Director of Technology Business Strategies for Venable, as well as Jeremy Haynes, who's the Account Exec for IDME. Lots of good things going to happen as we talk about electronic notarization day. We find out which product is best suited for you and how do you move to that process. I'm going to start off by introducing Ozzie Stallworth and let him have a few words, and he'll bring in his other participants to join us. And so hang tight. This is going to be a great session. Ozzie.
Thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate that. And welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, to this section on electronic notarization. My name is Ozzie Stallworth, and I'm with the Department of North Carolina Secretary of State. I'm the Electronic Notarization and Notary Enforcement Director, and it is a pleasure for me to be able to speak with you today on this panel with Jeremy Grant and Jeremy Hayes about electronic notarization. And so let's get right to it. When we talk about notarization in the context of the mortgage process or the mortgage closing, we know that notarization is a key component of the entire process. There are any number of documents that require notarization within a mortgage closing, whether it's the mortgage, the deed of trust, the affidavit of owner occupancy, subordination agreements, there's signature affidavits, and various other documents that might require notarization. And so as we are talking about electronic mortgage closing, we know that the one of the key components of being able to perform a fully electronic mortgage closing is actually tied up in the electronic notary, or the capability to have these documents that require notarization electronically notarized. And so recognizing this, in North Carolina, going back to 2005, we developed an electronic notarization program. And our electronic notarization program, what it envisioned and still incorporates today, is an in-person electronic notarization, commonly referred to as IPEN today. And so we knew that in order for us to get to the place where we would have a full end-to-end electronic mortgage closing, that we needed to have the ability for our notaries to perform this very critical act in the electronic arena. And so upon developing our electronic notarization program, we unfortunately ran into some struggles in terms of the great recession that we entered into, which really dampened all of the discussion and talk as it related to the electronic mortgage closing. And that was true straight through until 2016, where the CFPB conducted a pilot program for electronic mortgages. And at the conclusion of that program, they determined that it was something that was good for consumers, and they encouraged stakeholders to move forward with looking at building out electronic mortgage closing programs. And so we took that as our cue and started right away to looking at what it is that we could do in North Carolina to build on the 2005 electronic notarization program. And so what we did is we also passed laws related to electronic recording, electronic signature, so that we had a full legal infrastructure in place to support electronic mortgage closings. All of that resulted in our first electronic mortgage closing being done by North State Bank on May of 2017. Mr. Ken Sykes and his team, they took on the challenge and became our champion, such that we were able to have our first electronic mortgage closing. And then that was followed in July of 2018 by Amrock in conjunction with Quicken Loans. And they came in and started performing electronic mortgage closings at that time and have been doing so ever since. And next landmark that we want to mention is Truliant Credit Union. Truliant Federal Credit Union, they were the first credit union in North Carolina to perform a full end-to-end electronic closing. And they accomplished that on March of 2020. And they have continually been producing and providing this particular service for their customers since that point in time. And then moving into where we are today, we do have laws in place that will allow for remote online closings as well, commonly referred to as RON. We closed the first one with Quicken and Amrock here on July of 2020. And so we're well on our way in terms of being able to make sure that RON closings can take place in the state of North Carolina. We accomplished this by passing an emergency video notarization law. We refer to it as EVN. And the requirements of EVN is to use video conferencing technology. It's not specified what type, but you can use any of the available video conferencing technologies that are widely in use today. You have to display your identification to the notary over the video conference. The individual would sign the documents and send the electronic and or physical documents to the notary, depending on what type of notarial act is going to be performed. Sometimes there's a situation where a wet signature is needed, and in that instance, the physical document would also be sent to the notary so that they could fix their official wet signature and seal on that document. There's an emergency video notary certificate that would need to be completed as a part of this process as well. It identifies the counties where the principal signers were, where the notary was at the time of the notarization, as well as the date that that certificate was completed. And this law also requires the completion of a notary journal. Now, here's an image of what that certificate actually looks like. You'll notice that it just indicates the date that this certificate was signed, and then the location or counties in North Carolina that both the notary and the principal signer was actually in. It is important to note here that emergency video notarizations can be performed by any notary in the state of North Carolina, whether they are a traditional notary or an electronic notary. But the principal signer must be within the state borders at the time of the notarization. In other words, transboundary notarizations aren't allowed at this point in time. Now, the journal requirement is also something that we included in the emergency video notarization law. And in this particular slide, you'll see we have constructed a journal that notaries in North Carolina can download and use. It requires the date of completion, the time, the name of the signer, the type of the notarial act. It also has provisions where we require the notary to indicate whether or not there were other individuals in the room at the time of the notarization. And that information is going to be recorded in the journal as well. It indicates that the notary needs to record the type of audiovisual technology that was used. And it also has a place where the notary can confirm that both the notary and the principal signer could hear and see each other during the course of the actual notarial act. Now, it's important to understand that the emergency video notarization law allows for a remote online notarization. Now, in the e-closing environment, there's specific things that are going to be required, such as a video recording of the transaction. Now, whereas RON or the EVN does not specify or require that the transaction be recorded. It does have provisions where the transaction can be recorded. In fact, the solution that is used must be capable of recording in the event that there's a requirement with the industry partners to have that transaction recorded. Also, the identity proofing and credential analysis is something that is required for RON closings, whereas this is not specified in terms of it being a requirement for an EVN notarization. It also allows for e-closing solution that has been approved by the various industry participants, whether it's Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae. Those solutions that have been approved for use in the e-closing process do incorporate identity proofing and credential analysis tools and technologies, and those can be used in North Carolina as well. And so what this essentially means is that we do have the capability for a full RON closing to be done in the state of North Carolina. Now, the expiration date for our EVN is on March 1st, 2021. We're working very diligently to make sure that we have a permanent solution in place prior to the expiration date. Now, the other term that I want to mention here is RIN, the remote ink notarization. And that allows for a traditional notarization to be performed via the video technology that is customarily being used, whether or not it's a WebEx platform, GoToMeeting, or Zoom. The remote ink notarization allows the traditional notary to observe the signing of a document, and then that person can email the document to the notary such that the notary can print the document off and perform the notarial act and send that document back. And that would be referred to as a RIN notarization. So our EVN currently allows for all of that. We recently did a survey of several hundred notaries, and we found that there were more than 1,000 EVNs that had been performed at that point in time. And 98% of the folks who participated in this transaction were satisfied. The reports came back. And so there's some positive information that we have gained from these survey results indicating that this type of service is timely, it is useful, and is necessary that we're living in the time of the COVID crisis. We're also looking to make sure that we have a permanent solution for remote online notarization. Some of the things that we are currently contemplating are the transboundary notarization, proving various aspects of the technology, and authenticating the signer's identity. These are three critical areas that a number of stakeholders are working through to see whether or not we can get to a place where we would be able to move forward with a permanent piece of legislation that will allow for RON in North Carolina. I will mention in relations to the transboundary notarization, the primary concern that we have with this, and it is a real practical concern for the Secretary of State's office, is that we have law enforcement responsibility that requires us to investigate notary misconduct. And when we're investigating notary misconduct, it may be that the notary is involved with doing something that was improper, but it could also just as easily be the individual who presented the document to the notary. And in instances where that person is in another state or jurisdiction, we would not be able to fulfill our statutory responsibility to properly investigate and or bring charges against the individual who might have been a participant in wrongdoing. And then there are new aspects of the technology, such as the video conferencing software and its capabilities, and how far we need to go in terms of approving what is going to be acceptable versus not. And then one of the more significant areas that we're looking at is the authentication of the signer's identity. Many of you are aware what the most common method of establishing the identity is in a remote process. Knowledge-based authentication, or KBA, has been widely used over the past decade. We've recognized over a period of time that there are some practical challenges in terms of individuals not being able to use that because they don't have a credit profile. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the idea of the breaches that have occurred in various data gathering centers that also make that process a little bit suspect. So we're trying to identify other tools that will be able to be utilized to best authenticate the signer's identity in a remote situation. And so I'm very pleased to be able to share with you a few additional resources that you'll be able to look at in terms of understanding where notarization and remote notarization is currently in North Carolina, and what some of the requirements of some of the other institutions are related to the mortgage closing process, and to deal a little bit more with the various aspect of being able to authenticate the document signers in the best possible fashion. I'm pleased to be able to turn things over now to Jeremy Grant, who will be able to talk with you in greater detail about the different authentication protocols that are in place and the things that we need to be aware of to move forward to positively identify principles in this new environment that we're in. So thank you so very much. Jeremy, take it away.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Grant. I serve as a coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition, and thanks for the invitation to come speak to you today. Just as background, who am I? I've worked for more than 23 years at the intersection of identity and cybersecurity in a variety of roles in both government and industry. I've been a Senate staffer. I spent several years at NIST leading their Trusted Identities group and overseeing the national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace. I've spent more than 5 years architecting and building and delivering modern digital identity solutions, time as a market analyst in the space, and working most recently as a consultant with a number of clients, including some governments, trying to help them figure out what's the best way to deliver high assurance trusted identity solutions. So I was asked to come today to talk a little bit about sort of the state of the market and some of the work we're driving in the Better Identity Coalition. The coalition is a group that was launched in 2018 as an initiative of the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. We're focused on developing and advancing consensus-driven cross-sector policy solutions that promote the development and adoption of better solutions for identity verification and authentication. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means today. As you can see on my next slide, how we got started was really the Equifax breach from 2017, when there were a whole bunch of questions coming from policymakers and industry leaders around things like, what's the future of the Social Security number, as well as there was a hearing that popped up in the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce looking at the topic of identity verification in a post-breach world, and looking at the way that, our reliance on knowledge-based verification solutions for remote identity proofing. It might be time to look at something better, particularly in the wake of the big breach that we had. The organization today has more than 23 members, as you can see here. It's a mix of companies in financial services, insurers, payments, fintech, general technology companies, and then a whole bunch of security and identity vendors that are innovating and building and driving some of the next generation of solutions in this space. So talking about why we're here today, on this topic of identity, I thought it'd be good to bring up a cartoon that's a bit of an oldie but a goodie that helps to frame the challenge of why it is that we actually have these challenges in digital identity. So the cartoon here on slide 6 is more than 27 years old. It was published in July of 1993 by a cartoonist in the New Yorker, where the dog's on his computer and says to his friend, "The dog on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." So 27 years is a long time. It means that those dogs are long gone. In fact, their kids are probably dead too because of dog years. But the problem's actually with us more than ever today, both in terms of how would I say it? 27 years ago, this was a cartoon in terms of it captured some of the peculiarities of going online for the first time that people were running into, not knowing who was who. But most of it was funny. It was good-natured. Whereas these days, dogs on the internet are actively being weaponized against us by hackers and other cyber criminals. It's really an anomaly when a major breach happens these days and identity doesn't provide the attack vector. And more increasingly, or more lately rather, by other countries who are taking advantage of the inability to figure out who's who online to start interfering in our democracy. So we start thinking about, how do you really tackle this problem? And it's a hard problem to solve. There's a reason the cartoon's more relevant than ever after 27 years. It really starts to get into a whole bunch of issues, including security, but also privacy. How do you build more secure systems that can enhance privacy and not take it away? How do you deliver better customer experience? How do you do it in a way that complies with laws and regulations? How can you leverage identity in a way to lower transaction costs? And a lot of this really all gets wrapped up in one big issue, which is trust. How can we have digital identity systems that are trusted online? And I think if there's one thing we've seen since the dawn of the internet, it's that trust is really hard to get right. But identity, when done right, enables trust. Identity can be the great enabler, providing the foundation for digital transactions and online experiences that are more secure, that are easier to use, and that can protect privacy better than what we have today. The challenge, as we've seen, and this was something that was written up by some of my colleagues at NIST back in 2017, is that digital identity presents, some real technical challenges, and that the processes we use often involve proofing individuals over an open network. And they always involve the authentication of individual subjects over an open network. And NIST went on to say that the processes and technologies we use to establish and use digital identities offer multiple opportunities for impersonation and other attacks. So our approach to date, as we show in the next slide, has been one where we're trying to get stuff figured out and trying to do the best we can. But it has taken major life events like when your kid might get their first puppy, seems to be a frequent occurrence during this pandemic, and bringing some real new significance to the name that you might give that dog, since it's a security question you'll be asked again and again for the rest of your life. And as I point out on the next slide, a lot of these security questions we've asked haven't been really practical in terms of maybe you forget the answer, maybe you change your mind or you're not sure, and you say blue, no green, and you're thrown off into the pit of despair, also known in online services as the account recovery process. And as I point out on the next slide, it's really been a challenge when the adversaries and the cyber criminals already know the answer. If you look at some of the password policies that we've been trying to give people, this hasn't worked particularly well. I think all of you have probably seen some sort of a situation like this where, look, nobody can manage this for one password, let alone 20 or 30 or 200. Any password that meets this criteria is still susceptible to phishing and malware and password reuse. Frankly, there isn't such a thing as a strong password in 2020 because of the attacks that are being used to try and get through password-based systems. And quite notably, when you put these sorts of these systems in place and these rules, it makes your employees and your customers hate you. So when it comes to identity, we're starting to see there's some real costs. So our organization started to compile some of the data from different breach studies about 3 years ago. Looking to 2017, we saw 17 million victims of identity fraud, $17 billion nearly stolen as a result of fraud. A 45% increase in data breaches from 2016 to 2017, nearly a 389% increase over the volume of data that's actually been stolen. And the numbers go on to show that the fact that we don't have this issue solved is actually creating some real cost to society. And one thing we've seen is synthetic identity fraud is on the rise, where you're seeing criminals might take some partially made up information and pair it with a real identifier, say taking a fake name and a real social security number, and using it to trick the banks and some of the providers they work with for identity resolution to create identities that aren't real at all, but are really digital Frankenstein. So this is a clip on this slide from a recent Federal Reserve paper where they pointed out it's the fastest growing type of financial crime in the U.S. And, unfortunately, all of this just got worse thanks to the pandemic we're in. So one of the first things that happened when, at least at the federal government level, when things started to shut down in March, was the White House basically ordered a partial shutdown of citizen-facing government services. Basically said, look, if there's a service that can't be performed remotely, it's going to require an in-person transaction. Well, those just aren't going to be around for a while. And as we started to push relief checks out to people and to businesses, lots of it was really hindered by the inability to actually figure out who was who. Among other things, more than 1 million dead people were given stimulus checks, and that Treasury wasn't actually checking a list that the Social Security Administration has to see who's still alive and who's not. We've also seen a lot of people with stories of they were never able to get stimulus checks they were eligible for because the IRS simply couldn't find them or didn't know the right bank account or address to send it to. And in the States, we've seen some massive fraud against state unemployment insurance programs, as we see on this next slide, where we basically are seeing a lot of attackers leveraging stolen data sets to impersonate people and claim their unemployment benefits before they're able to get to them. This has been to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. So in just a few weeks ago, FinCEN, the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, which is the part of the U.S. Treasury Department that, as the name would suggest, is focused on tracking down and enforcing laws on financial crimes, pointed out they're now seeing more than $1 billion a month in identity-related cyber fraud in the banking system. Between account takeovers, doing things like trying to steal people's passwords, business email compromise, where they use identity to spoof an executive in an organization, traditional identity theft and synthetic identity fraud. It's more than $1 billion a month, and they pointed out the numbers are going much higher in this era when we can't be doing in-person transactions. Now, meanwhile, in Europe, we saw a really different thing come out from the European Commission government in March. They were putting out a blog post that was almost boasting about how, thanks to their investment in digital identity over the years, citizens don't have to leave their homes to interact with government. They don't have to meet face-to-face or sign documents. And they pointed out, our ability to keep government functioning, thanks to this big investment we've made in digital identity infrastructure, is another way to achieve social distancing. And I think, a key message that has really been driven home these last few months amidst the pandemic is that identity infrastructure is critical infrastructure. It's, something that, if we're going to have secure online commerce, it's something that is an essential layer. So I've talked a lot about the problem. Let's pivot a little bit to talk about why has this been so hard to solve? Well, one of the big issues is what we talk about in the coalition is what we call the identity gap, which is the fact that the U.S. has a number of nationally recognized authoritative identity systems, the driver's license, the passport, the social security number, at least as an identifier to try and figure out, say, which Jeremy Grant is which. By the way, I'm not the 6'8" power forward for the Denver Nuggets who had a great playoff series who spells his name wrong. In my next life, perhaps. But anyways, I digress. We've got a number of authoritative systems that are out there, but everything's trapped in the paper world. And so when we try to go online, while I might be able to bring my driver's license or my passport in person to conduct a transaction, none of that actually translates into the online world. So if you've ever been trying to do a transaction, say to apply for a new credit card or other type of loan, or establish an account for the first time with a government agency, and you were asked a question like this: which of the following 4 banks gave you a loan in 2013? Well, this was knowledge-based verification. These were systems that were focused on trying to get around the identity gap that I talked about, basically offered by the 3 major credit bureaus and some other specialty providers. Look, this was something industry pulled together because we needed something to enable trusted digital commerce, and because the government didn't have a way to take those paper and plastic documents and bring them online, this was the best solution out there. So it worked for a while, but what we're seeing today now is attackers have caught up. The idea of these questions, what people call out-of-wallet questions, meaning if I found your wallet on the street, I wouldn't be able to answer one of these quizzes, aren't as secret as they used to be, in large part because we've seen so many different breaches over the years. So in fact, 2 years before the famous Equifax breach, the IRS in 2015 had a really big breach where more than 700,000 Americans had their tax transcripts compromised using these knowledge-based systems. And as you can see at the bottom corner of the screen, it says, look, the hackers already had the keys from other breaches. They had stolen sets of information that they were able to use to cut through these systems. And, my old partners at NIST, where I used to work, have said, you specifically should not be using knowledge-based verification to satisfy identity proofing requirements at what they would call a medium or high assurance level. It can provide one layer of a tool and play a role in it, but it's not a solution in and of itself that gives you any sort of decent assurance in terms of whether somebody is who they claim to be in 2020. So knowing that there's a lot of discussion right now in this conference around how can you enable online notarization and what role can it play in terms of enabling more high value transactions to be conducted online. One thing that we're constantly pointing out is whether it's knowledge-based verification or other technology, you don't want to mandate technology in law. What you want to do is point to standards. Because you're seeing attackers are constantly innovating to defeat new security tools that we come up with. And if a legislation is calling out a specific type of technology, it's certain to be outdated. And so, our recommendation is don't try to call out technology in legislation, but you can reference a NIST standard. It's actually a great way to future-proof the law, and that NIST does digital identity guidelines. It's a document known as Special Publication 800-63. They update them every few years for the whole country. In fact, the whole world tends to leverage them. And the nice thing about the update is it reflects both where the threat is advancing as well as where there's tools to mitigate the threat. So what NIST defines, they have three different identity assurance levels. And, low was known as IAL1. It's not that meaningful. But identity assurance level 2, lays out a pretty high level of assurance and outlines a lot of different ways you can achieve it, layering on a number of different tools. And the great thing that's out there, and I think you'll hear about one of these certified solutions today through my colleague Jeremy Haynes, who's at a company called ID.me, is that you've got industry certification programs that are crafted in part with government input that exist to assess different identity products against this NIST criteria. So you can leverage these industry certified products in your own applications if you're looking for a way to figure things out. Beyond that, in terms of what's next, I want to show a video real quick looking at what's happening with mobile driver's licenses in the U.S., where we're seeing a big push right now in a number of the states. In fact, North Carolina was one of the first states to pilot one, though they haven't rolled it out across the state yet, to give people essentially an app on their phone that is bound to their driver's license. And I'll pause for a moment so you can see this minute-long video and get a little bit more of an idea about things, and then wrap up with a couple concluding comments.
Imagine for a moment all the places where a copy of your driver's license might live. The DMV, your bank, your employer, and likely everywhere else you've worked. Ever emailed your license? It's in your sent messages, in someone else's inbox. It's all too much. The driver's license is the #1 source of identity in the United States, and many of us have lost track of who has a copy. There's a better way. As much of our world moves online, it's time to rethink how we verify identity and protect privacy. It starts with modernizing the trusted systems already in place. For generations, we've relied on these agencies to help us prove who we are in the physical world. Now, they can bring solutions to the online one. The next time you conduct important business online, like apply for a loan, what if there was a mobile driver's license app offered through your DMV that could quickly and securely validate your identity? These solutions will make us safer and move us forward so that we can truly take advantage of all the online world has to offer. Visit betteridentity.org to learn more.
So finally, I wanted to point out there's legislation that was introduced recently in the U.S. Congress. Bipartisan coalition of Democrats and Republicans came together to introduce H.R. 8215, the Improving Digital Identity Act of 2020. It was focused to coordinate a government-wide approach, looking at not just federal, but also state and local levels, in terms of how do you come up with a broader government-wide solution to leveraging all of these paper and plastic systems we have today and bringing them onto the digital world. It authorizes a new grant program as well to state governments to help them accelerate the rollout of these new mobile driver's license solutions. And so, right now it is still just a bill on Capitol Hill, but we've been working closely with folks from all parties as well as the executive branch on some of these tools. And we're excited that might provide a foundation to help jumpstart some of the solutions to the problems we're looking to solve. So with that, I'll wrap up. Here's on this last slide my contact information, and look forward to talking more about this on the panel. Thank you.
And thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys today. My presentation is going to be on KBV and kind of walking through some of the demonstrated security and usability concerns with the channel. KBV stands for Knowledge-Based Verification. And again, my name is Jeremy Haynes. I'm an account executive at ID.me. So there are a couple of kind of key publications that have shaped the digital identity landscape today. Mr. Grant, as you just heard from, he's shaped and authored two of these three that you see here, but really the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, the NSTIC, shaped what should be the four guiding principles for identity verification authentication. And if you look at ID.me, we work really hard to align to these guiding principles. And also in that strategy, it called for NIST to develop updated guidance on how to properly verify individuals. And in 2017, they released NIST Special Publication 863.3. And ID.me is actually the first and still the only credential service provider to be certified against NIST guidelines. And that's important because it lets you know that we're up to standard. And also the NIST guidelines were designed to prevent against remote and scalable attacks. So what is KBV? Knowledge-based verification can also be referred to as dynamic KBV, but it's a series of multiple choice questions that are generated dynamically from essentially credit bureaus to Experian, TransUnion, and others. A good example would be, which of the following retail credit cards do you have? What is your approximate monthly mortgage payment? We'll get into some of the pitfalls later, but they're not the easiest questions in the world, and they can also be researched by attackers. And then just wanted to make the distinction. Some of you may have heard knowledge-based authentication, or KBA. This is also known as static KBA, but it's used for authentication purposes. So kind of pre-shared secrets. What is your favorite food? Pizza, what middle school did you attend? Things of that nature. So we just wanted to be clear that today we're talking about KBV and not KBA. Here's an example of how to start a knowledge-based verification flow. You'd enter in your date of birth, social security number, address of record, and that would essentially populate a list of questions. Now, if you look at this starting slide here, all of this information, if you were one of the 149 million records that was exposed in an Equifax breach or other data breach, a fraudster could get the information and the valid data to start populating some of these questions. And then on the second screen, you'll see some of the questions that are associated with it. From a usability standpoint and verifying the identity of a genuine user, they're not very easy to use. And then also from a fraud perspective, you could be able to Google some of these questions. None of the above is also a common choice, and fraudsters can write algorithms to just write none of the above and try multiple identities at scale. So what we've created is essentially an environment where when this method's used, that it's not very usable. We find that KBV is often less than 70% percentile of pass rates. So not very usable, but also pretty easy for the fraudsters relative to some of the stronger mechanisms. As we mentioned, KBV can be defeated. Answers to the questions can be found social media, public records, dark web, and also KBV really doesn't break the 70th percentile, as I mentioned before. And if you ask harder questions, you see a direct and correlated drop in the number of legitimate users who are able to pass. I'll just go into a little bit more detail, some of the proven attack methods that have been used. For the mortgage payment question, you could calculate a best guess on what the mortgage payment is going to look like using tools like Zillow. If someone's asking what type of car you drive or a car registration, you could look at social media, but even a Google Street View of someone's house might yield the exact answer that an attacker is looking for. These are proven attack methods, and through some data breaches like IRS Get Transcript and a couple of others, KBV was actually the mechanism that was able to be defeated and expose those records. There's also guidance. A great report written by GAO 19288 talks in great detail how stolen data breaches such as Equifax have basically made KBV no longer a viable option for identity proofing. So if you go through, it points to NIST guidance, which effectively prohibits agencies from using knowledge-based verification, especially for stronger identity proofing mechanisms. Lastly, I want to talk about what some of the options are available. So if KBV isn't something to get confidence in, then what methods do we have? Document verification and telecom verification continue to be the strongest mechanisms that you have. At IDMe, for example, telecom verification is kind of our strongest control against preventing remote and scalable attack. Not only can you verify the subscriber's identity associated with the underlying device, but we're able to look for key fraud characteristics such as, has the SIM been swapped? Has the phone number been ported? Is the user in the same location as the billing address? So incredibly valuable information from a fraud standpoint, and also confirmation in the identity. Where KBV at most would be associated with about 70% pass rates, we're able to see mobile device verification pass for about 94% of users. So much easier to use, higher pass rates of genuine users, and also stronger than traditional KBV. We also offer document verification, so scanning a picture of your driver's license, front and back, and that can be compared to a selfie with liveness detection to verify that you're actually the owner of the particular piece of evidence. So both of those mechanisms, IDMe recommends as a way to get around KBV. And in the cases where we do use KBV, we require telecom verification to be used in conjunction to get additional confidence in the identity. Just wanted to, if you look on this slide, it shows some of the common fraud characteristics that IDMe is able to grab from going to the device itself. Was the text message received by the same device to which the phone number is assigned? The phone number registered in the user's name? Was there a SIM swap, phone port? Has the device been associated with fraud previously? One of the reasons that it prevents against remote and scalable fraud is that attackers would actually need to get physical ownership of the device in order to defeat it, or create a bunch of phones that are clean and not used to commit fraud previously. The other channel I wanted to mention, which we're seeing growth in, and it's also specified in NIST guidelines, but is virtual in-person identity proofing. In order to generate those KBV questions, you're required to have a credit history, and that information needs to be accurate in the credit bureaus. And through our work identity proofing applicants, we find a whole bunch of use cases where a genuine, authentic user is unable to be corroborated in authoritative financial records. And when it's accessing government services or something as vital as being able to go through and sign your mortgage documents, it's imperative that we create channels where we can validate and verify people's identities across all channels with as close to 100% success rates as possible. So there are common pitfalls. Users with an unregistered prepaid phone wouldn't be able to get that confidence in device verification. Women who have been married and their names changed, the credit bureau may not have the most up-to-date records. So what IDMe created was virtual in-person identity proofing, and it's a supervised remote channel that allows a user to verify their identity live on a video call, such as this. They'll preload a wider variety of identity documents, which will be reviewed by an IDMe trusted referee, and then they'll join a live video call. And so we see this as a way not only for genuine users to validate their identity, but also as a deterrent to fraud. Fraudsters are pretty uncomfortable joining a live recorded video session right before they commit said fraud. So if there's any takeaway from this, is that KBV is not should not be trusted. It's being exploited across the country today, especially in the pandemic with unemployment assistance, SBA with the Paycheck Protection Program. So those vulnerabilities in KBV are being exploited at scale and highlighted in the pandemic, and that there are stronger, more secure, and more inclusive identity verification options out there: the device, document, and supervised remote identity proofing channels such as virtual in-person proofing. So that includes what I had presented to speak with you all today. I look forward to answering any questions you have, and back over to you, Ken.
Thank you, Ozzie and Jeremy Haynes and Jeremy Grant, for that great informative session. That was really, really terrific. And I'm certainly, that poses a lot of questions from our audience. And so right now we're going to go to the Q&A part of our session one presentation. And so we're going to answer some questions from you all, and they can be directed towards Ozzie, Jeremy Haynes, or Jeremy Grant. So let's get some questions answered.